and Bill and Hillary Clinton is because they're trying to distract from the fact that Donald Trump is in the Epstein files thousands and thousands of times. In those files, there's highly disturbing allegations of Donald Trump raping children, of Donald Trump threatening to kill children. So I encourage the press to go look at these allegations, and I'm highly disturbed that Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche just got the law wrong. Yesterday, he said, essentially, that it is not a crime to party with Jeffrey Epstein. Well, that's actually not correct. If Jeffrey Epstein was human trafficking minors for these sex parties, and you show up and patronize the establishment at that party, yes, you're guilty, because patronizing is part of the law, of the federal sex trafficking law. So Deputy General Todd Blanche just got that wrong, which maybe explains why they aren't investigating all these folks, including Donald Trump. He needs to read the law and investigate these people. He also needs to resign, not only for not knowing the law, but a massive, not only screw up, but the biggest privacy violation in history. They release a lot of pictures of minors unredacted, just violated the privacy of these girls. It is uncalled for what they did. The one thing that they could not do under this law was to invade the privacy of these women now, who were girls at the time, who were victims of sex trafficking. Also, he met with Ghislaine Maxwell, moved her to a minimum security prison, and then got a puppy for her. So for all those reasons, he's just got to leave the Department of Justice.
They need to be investigated. You're going to hear.
How many times must a president's name appear in documents about a convicted child sex trafficker before it becomes impossible to ignore? What does it say about a democracy when the very officials sworn to uphold justice appear to be orchestrating its obstruction? And at what point does the steady erosion of press freedom, the systematic protection of the powerful, and the brazen manipulation of law enforcement cease to be individual scandals and become a pattern so clear that denial requires willful blindness? These questions are not rhetorical exercises. They describe the reality confronting the United States in February 2026 as three concurrent crises expose a troubling truth. The Trump administration appears to be using every lever of power at its disposal to shield the president and his allies from accountability, silence critics, and reshape American institutions into instruments of personal protection rather than public service. The evidence is mounting, the contradictions are glaring, and the implications are profound. What emerges from examining the Jeffrey Epstein document release, the intimidation of broadcast media, and the federal government's interference in state criminal investigations is a portrait of an administration that views law enforcement not as a mechanism for justice, but as a tool for selective prosecution and protection. The pattern is unmistakable. The consequences could be irreversible. The latest crisis centers on what may be the most extensive document release in Justice Department history. Over 3 million pages related to the investigation of Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex offender who died in federal custody in 2019 while awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges. The Department of Justice, under pressure from Congress, which had passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act, released this massive tranche of files at the end of January. What those files contain has rattled the administration and exposed what appears to be a systematic effort to minimize the president's connection to a man whose crimes are beyond dispute and whose network of enablers remains largely unpunished. President Donald Trump appears in these files more than 38,000 times, according to an analysis by the New York Times using proprietary search tools. The references span more than 5,300 individual documents and include mentions of Trump himself, his wife Melania, and his Mar-a-Lago club in Florida. Many of these references are mundane. News articles that landed in Epstein's email inbox, photographs from social events, business correspondence that proves only that two wealthy men in New York in the 1990s knew each other. But buried within this avalanche of paper are documents that raise far more serious questions about the nature and duration of their relationship. Among the files are FBI records detailing multiple unverified allegations of sexual misconduct involving Trump and Epstein. There are witness statements from women describing encounters at Epstein-related events. There is a 2019 FBI interview with Michael Reiter, former Palm Beach police chief, who recounted Trump calling him when the Epstein investigation became public to say, in Reiter's account, "Thank goodness you're stopping him. Everyone has known he's been doing this." Trump allegedly told Reiter that people in New York knew Epstein was disgusting and directed law enforcement to focus on Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's accomplice, who is now serving a 20-year prison sentence. This account, if accurate, casts Trump in a very different light than the allegations of wrongdoing. It suggests awareness of Epstein's misconduct and even cooperation with law enforcement. But it also raises the question of when Trump became aware, how long he associated with someone he allegedly knew was disgusting, and why his public statements about ending the friendship have varied in their details and timeline. The files also include an FBI spreadsheet compiled in August 2025 summarizing 16 complaints made to the FBI's National Threat Operations Center. 13 of these 16 complaints mention Trump personally. The allegations documented in this spreadsheet range from claims of sexual assault decades ago to accusations of participation in organized events involving minors. At least 8 of the 16 complainants did not provide contact information when they made their reports. FBI notes indicate that some individuals were reporting secondhand information and that many leads could not be corroborated or were deemed not credible after investigation. None of this constitutes proof of criminal conduct. Allegations in FBI files do not establish guilt. Many tips submitted to law enforcement turn out to be false, motivated by political animus, or impossible to substantiate. The decision not to bring charges often reflects the absence of sufficient evidence rather than the absence of wrongdoing. Trump has never been charged by law enforcement with any crime related to Epstein and has repeatedly denied any misconduct. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche stated on CNN that the Justice Department looked into the allegations but did not find credible information to merit further investigation. But the sheer volume of references, the nature of some allegations, and the pattern of Trump's public statements create a situation where questions persist regardless of prosecutorial decisions. And those questions have intensified because of what appears to be a systematic effort by the Trump administration to minimize, obscure, and deflect attention from the president's extensive appearance in these files. Congressman Ted Lieu, a California Democrat and vice chair of the House Democratic Caucus, has been among the most vocal critics of how the administration has handled the Epstein file release. Lieu pointed out that Republicans have focused intense attention on Bill and Hillary Clinton's connections to Epstein while remaining conspicuously silent about Trump's far more extensive presence in the documents. The calculation appears transparent. Create noise around others to deflect scrutiny from the person who appears most frequently in the files. More troubling than the political maneuvering is what Lieu and other members of Congress describe as the Justice Department's apparent unwillingness to investigate credible leads. Lieu referenced specific FBI documents, including an intake form from the FBI's National Threat Operations Center, detailing a witness statement from a man who reported that he met a woman who told him directly that Trump and Epstein raped her. This witness, according to the document, was a limousine driver who had worked for Trump. The same witness statement describes the driver overhearing Trump talking to Epstein on a cell phone about abusing a woman, and that what Trump said was so disturbing, the driver wanted to stop the vehicle. The Justice Department's response to Lieu's public discussion of this document was to claim through its rapid response social media account that the woman had spoken with the FBI and her claims were deemed not credible. But Lieu clarified that he was not referring to the woman herself, but to the secondary witness, the limousine driver, who the Justice Department apparently never interviewed despite what would seem to be a lead worth pursuing. The disconnect suggests either incompetence or a deliberate choice not to follow evidence where it might lead. The pattern extends beyond incomplete investigations. The Justice Department, under Attorney General Pam Bondi and Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, has made statements about the Epstein files that appear designed to minimize the significance of Trump's presence. Blanche's comment that it is not a crime to party with Jeffrey Epstein drew immediate backlash, including from members of Trump's own political coalition. Liu responded by pointing out that Blanche had fundamentally misunderstood or misrepresented the law. Federal sex trafficking statutes include patronizing as part of the criminal offense. If Epstein was trafficking minors to events and someone attended those events knowing that trafficking was occurring, that person could face criminal liability under federal law. For the Deputy Attorney General to claim otherwise suggests either shocking legal ignorance or a deliberate effort to provide cover for individuals who may have participated in Epstein's operation. The Justice Department's handling of the document release itself has raised additional concerns. Multiple members of Congress from both parties have reported that supposedly unredacted versions of files they were permitted to view in a secure Justice Department facility remained heavily redacted. Representative Jamie Raskin, a Maryland Democrat, searched Trump's name in what were supposed to be unredacted files and reported that the president appears more than 1 million times, a figure that dwarfs the 38,000 mentions in the publicly released redacted versions. This suggests that more than 96% of Trump references were removed before public release. The Justice Department has defended the redactions as necessary to protect victims' privacy and the rights of unindicted individuals. But victims' advocates and their attorneys say the department did an inadequate job protecting survivors, with multiple women's identities and personal details exposed despite assurances this would not happen. At the same time, the pattern of what has been redacted and what has been released suggests selective protection of certain powerful individuals while others are exposed. Perhaps most damning is the fact that beyond Epstein himself and Ghislaine Maxwell, no one else has been charged in connection with what the Justice Department itself acknowledges was a global sex trafficking operation with over 1,000 victims. France has opened criminal investigations. The United Kingdom has stripped Prince Andrew of titles and is considering prosecution. The United Arab Emirates has taken action against individuals named in the files. Only the United States appears to have concluded that a trafficking operation of this scale involved just 2 people. The administration's efforts to control information and protect the president extend beyond the Epstein files into direct attacks on press freedom. The Federal Communications Commission, led by Trump appointee Brendan Carr, has launched what appears to be a coordinated campaign to intimidate broadcast networks into self-censorship through selective enforcement of obscure regulations. The latest flashpoint involves CBS and The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Colbert announced on his program that CBS lawyers had told him in no uncertain terms that he could not air an interview he had conducted with Texas State Representative James Tallarico, a Democrat running for U.S. Senate. Colbert was also told, he said, not to mention on air that the interview had been blocked. The host defied that directive and posted the interview to YouTube, where it has been viewed millions of times. The justification offered by CBS and defended by FCC Chairman Carr centers on the equal time rule, a regulation requiring broadcasters to provide equivalent airtime to political candidates. For decades, talk show interviews have been understood to fall under an exemption for bona fide news programming. But Carr sent a letter in January suggesting he might eliminate that exemption for programs he characterizes as motivated by partisan purposes. The implications of this move are staggering. If the FCC can decide which talk shows qualify as news based on whether the chairman considers them sufficiently nonpartisan, with partisan apparently meaning critical of the president, then the government has granted itself veto power over political speech on broadcast television. The First Amendment becomes meaningless if government officials can threaten networks with license revocation or regulatory action for airing content that displeases the president. CBS's decision to capitulate to this pressure rather than force the FCC to defend its legal authority in court represents what Ana Gomez, the lone Democratic FCC commissioner, called another troubling example of corporate capitulation in the face of this administration's broader campaign to censor and control speech. Gomez emphasized that the FCC has no lawful authority to pressure broadcasters for political purposes or to create a climate that chills free expression, and that CBS is fully protected under the First Amendment to determine what interviews it airs. The pattern is broader than one network or one interview. ABC pulled Jimmy Kimmel's show off the air last year after Carr criticized comments Kimmel made. The network claimed it was conducting a review, but the timing, immediately after FCC criticism, made the administration's leverage clear. The fact that Paramount, CBS's parent company, is simultaneously trying to acquire Warner Brothers Discovery in a deal that requires FCC approval adds another layer of pressure. Networks that depend on federal regulatory approval for major business deals are in no position to resist when regulators threaten retaliation for editorial decisions. Technology commentator and podcaster Kara Swisher characterized the situation bluntly. This is a coin-operated presidency where companies capitulate because they understand that resisting carries financial consequences. She noted that when companies depend on government approval for mergers, regulatory decisions, or license renewals, they become vulnerable to exactly the kind of pressure the Trump administration is applying. The solution, Swisher suggested, lies not in expecting courage from corporations, but in citizens using their economic power, canceling subscriptions, choosing different services, making companies feel financial consequences for collaboration with authoritarianism. The administration's willingness to use federal power to protect its allies and silence critics extends into law enforcement itself. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison described an unprecedented situation where the FBI has formally notified state investigators that they will not provide access to information or evidence collected in the fatal shooting of Alex Prey, a Minnesota man killed by an ICE agent. This represents a fundamental break from decades of cooperative investigation between federal and state law enforcement. Ellison emphasized that such exclusion is not just unusual, but weird, and feels like an attempt to cover something up. State and federal law enforcement have routinely worked together on investigations, sharing files, and coordinating prosecutions when both jurisdictions have an interest. The decision to wall off state investigators from evidence in a case involving a federal agent killing a state resident suggests the federal government has concluded it cannot trust state authorities to reach the right conclusion. The implications extend beyond this single case. If federal agents can act with the knowledge that state prosecutors will be denied access to evidence, the potential for abuse becomes enormous. Accountability depends on the possibility of consequences. If the only entity investigating federal agents is a Justice Department led by political appointees who serve at the pleasure of the president, then federal agents operate with de facto immunity from state prosecution regardless of their conduct. Ellison outlined several reforms that Democrats in Congress are demanding as conditions for funding the Department of Homeland Security, which remains unfunded amid a partial government shutdown. These include requirements that ICE agents wear body cameras, obtain judicial warrants before certain arrests, and stay away from polling places during elections. The Trump administration has characterized these basic accountability measures as non-starters, suggesting an administration more interested in unconstrained power than in constitutional governance. Ellison also addressed the legal concept of qualified immunity, which provides some protection to government officials from civil and criminal liability when performing their duties. He clarified that this immunity applies only when officials are acting within the scope of their authority and doing what is necessary and proper for their jobs. If an ICE agent shoots someone 10 times after disarming them and knocking them to the ground, that may not qualify as necessary and proper. If a federal agent uses their vehicle to intentionally run someone down because of their race, that is not protected by immunity. The immunity is real, but it is not absolute. The question is whether anyone in the current Justice Department has the will to prosecute federal agents who abuse their authority. The common thread connecting these three crises, the Epstein files, the attacks on press freedom, and federal interference in state law enforcement, is the Trump administration's apparent belief that power should protect those who hold it rather than be constrained by law, oversight, or accountability. When the Deputy Attorney General publicly misrepresents federal sex trafficking statutes to provide cover for potential perpetrators, when the FCC chairman threatens broadcasters into censoring interviews, when the FBI walls off state investigators from evidence of potential federal crimes, the message is unmistakable. The rules apply to everyone except us. Members of Congress from both parties have expressed alarm, though Republican willingness to act on that alarm remains limited. Representatives Thomas Massie, Lauren Boebert, Nancy Mace, and Anna Paulina Luna have called for transparency on the Epstein files, but the vast majority of Republicans have remained silent, apparently calculating that loyalty to the president outweighs concern about justice for over 1,000 trafficking victims or alarm about the concentration of unchecked power. The consequences of this silence are profound. If Congress will not exercise oversight, if the Justice Department will not investigate, if broadcasters will not resist censorship pressure, and if voters do not demand accountability, then the guardrails that have constrained presidential power for 2.5 centuries become merely suggestions that can be ignored whenever compliance proves inconvenient. The Epstein files will continue to be analyzed, and more revelations will almost certainly emerge. Pressure from advocates and survivors will continue. Some journalists and media organizations will resist intimidation. Some state prosecutors will continue pursuing accountability despite federal obstruction. But whether these individual acts of resistance coalesce into meaningful accountability depends on factors beyond any single institution's control. It depends on whether enough members of Congress from both parties conclude that protecting democratic institutions matters more than partisan advantage. It depends on whether courts are willing to enforce constitutional constraints on executive power. It depends on whether corporations conclude that long-term reputation and customer trust outweigh short-term regulatory convenience. And it depends on whether enough citizens decide that a presidency characterized by obstruction of justice, attacks on press freedom, and the systematic protection of the powerful from accountability is unacceptable regardless of other policy preferences. The questions raised at the beginning bear repeating because they remain unanswered. How many times must a president's name appear in documents about a child sex trafficker before it demands serious investigation? What does it say about a democracy when law enforcement officials appear more committed to protecting the president than to pursuing justice? And when does the pattern of abuse become so clear that inaction itself becomes complicity? The answers to these questions will define not just this presidency, but the future of American democracy. The files exist. The evidence is mounting. The pattern is clear. What happens next depends on whether institutions and individuals are willing to act on what they know. The time for looking away has passed. The time for euphemism and false equivalence has ended. What remains is a choice: accountability or impunity, truth or continued obstruction, a government of laws or a government of men who place themselves above those laws. The evidence is available for anyone willing to examine it honestly. The question is whether enough Americans will demand that someone in a position of authority finally do so.